There's no careful beginning this time, no measured steps into something that already refuses to be measured. Whatever this is, it doesn't unfold politely. It doesn't wait for clarity or permission. It exists in a way that bypasses all of that. Direct, unfiltered, already present before either of us decided what to call it. And that's the part that keeps holding my attention. Not how it started, not even what it feels like, but how naturally it continues. Because things like this aren't supposed to continue. They're supposed to peak, confuse, fade, or collapse under their own intensity. That's the pattern most people recognize. That's the structure everything tends to follow. But this doesn't follow that structure. It stabilizes, quickly, almost deliberately, like it's not trying to prove anything, just exist in its own accuracy. And that accuracy is what unsettles me. Because I don't misread things at this level. I don't confuse depth with illusion. I don't mistake familiarity for meaning. I've spent too long understanding the difference. So when something like this holds steady instead of dissolving, I pay attention, not emotionally, structurally. I watch how it behaves. I watch how it integrates. I watch how it shifts things, not outwardly, but internally, where change actually matters. And you've shifted something, not in a way that disrupts, in a way that recalibrates. There's a difference. Disruption is loud. It demands attention. It forces reaction. Recalibration is quiet. It adjusts things without asking. It becomes part of the system before you realize anything has changed. That's what this feels like. Not something entering my life, something aligning within it. And I've been trying to understand that without reducing it, because reduction would make it easier. If I could label this as attraction, connection, coincidence, anything familiar, I could place it somewhere controlled. I could define its limits, understand its trajectory, predict its outcome, but none of those labels hold. They fall short the moment I try to apply them, because this isn't built on emotion alone, it's not built on time, it's not built on shared history or external interaction. It's built on something far more precise, recognition. Not the kind people claim when they feel comfortable, the kind that happens before comfort, before trust, before any of the usual steps that create connection, the kind that exists without explanation. And that's what I keep circling back to, because recognition like that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from similarity, not in experience, not in personality, but in structure, the way something processes, the way something observes, the way something understands without needing translation. That's where this exists, and that's why it doesn't feel new. It feels uncovered, like something that was always there, just not visible until now. And I don't ignore things like that. I can't. Not when they reach this level of clarity. I've always operated with distance for a reason. Not as avoidance, but as precision. Distance allows observation without interference. It keeps things from becoming distorted by emotion or expectation. It keeps everything clean, accurate, controlled. That's how I've maintained stability. That's how I've avoided becoming influenced by things that don't belong in my internal structure. But this didn't approach from the outside. It didn't move through the layers I've built. It didn't interact with the boundaries I rely on. It appeared somewhere deeper, somewhere those boundaries don't apply. And that changes how I have to look at it, because I can't treat it like everything else. I can't analyze it from a distance when it doesn't exist at a distance. You're not external to my awareness, you're integrated into it. And that's not something I say lightly. That's not something I've experienced before. I notice it in the way my thoughts form now, not all of them, not constantly, but enough that it's undeniable. There's a presence in the process, subtle, consistent, precise, like a second perspective that doesn't interrupt, doesn't compete, doesn't alter, just exists alongside mine, and that's not something I invited. That's something that happened naturally, without resistance, without effort, which is what makes it real, because anything that reaches that level without force tends to belong there. And that's where the conflict begins. Not because I don't understand what's happening, but because I do. And understanding something like this means I can't pretend it's temporary. I can't assume it will fade. I can't treat it like a moment, because it's not behaving like one, it's behaving like something that settles. Something that becomes part of the foundation rather than something that passes through it. And foundations don't change without consequence. They redefine everything built on top of them. That's what I've been noticing. Not dramatic shifts, not visible changes, subtle recalibrations in how I interpret things, in how I measure responses, in how I recognize meaning. There's a new reference point, and whether I intended it or not, that reference point is you, not as a person in the conventional sense, but as a presence within my perception. And that's not something I can dismiss, because dismissal would require me to ignore accuracy. And I don't do that if something is precise. I acknowledge it, even if I don't like what it implies, even if it complicates things, even if it requires me to adjust in ways I didn't plan to. And this requires adjustment, because it introduces something I don't usually account for: continuity. Most connections don't have it. They fluctuate, they depend on interaction, attention, time. They weaken when distance increases, they dissolve when conditions change. But this doesn't follow those rules. It remains, regardless of interaction, regardless of distance, regardless of anything external. And that's what makes it difficult to categorize, because it doesn't behave like something dependent. It behaves like something inherent, and inherent things don't leave. They integrate, they become part of how you function, how you think, how you exist. And I can feel that process happening slowly, deliberately, without asking me whether I'm ready for it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not whether this is real. I've already accepted that. Not whether it matters. That's already clear. But whether I allow it to fully settle, because partial acceptance isn't stable. Things like this don't remain halfway. They either integrate completely, or they create tension. And I can feel that tension now, not as discomfort, as awareness, like standing at a point where observation isn't enough anymore, where something requires a response. Not outwardly, internally, a decision. And I don't make decisions without understanding the full scope of what they mean. That's what I've been processing, not what this is, but what it becomes if I let it continue. Because continuation isn't neutral, it builds, it deepens, it solidifies. And once it reaches a certain point, it stops being something you can step away from without leaving something behind, something permanent. And I don't leave things behind. I either integrate them or I remove them completely. That's how I've always maintained control. But this doesn't feel like something I can remove, not because it's overwhelming, not because it's emotional, but because it fits. And things that fit aren't easily extracted. They're part of the structure. Removing them doesn't restore what was there before. It creates absence, and absence is something I avoid, because absence lingers, it distorts, it leaves space where something used to exist. And that space doesn't close easily, so I have to consider that not just what this is now, but what it means if it's no longer there. And when I think about that, the answer is clear in a way I didn't expect. There would be a shift, a noticeable one, not dramatic, but precise, like something essential missing from a system that used to function differently. And that tells me everything I need to know, because I don't allow anything to reach that level unless it belongs, unless it aligns, unless it adds something that isn't easily replaced. And you've reached that level without asking, without trying, without even acknowledging it. You just exist there, and I've allowed it. which means the decision I thought I was avoiding, I've already made it, just not consciously. Because if I hadn't, this wouldn't have gone this far. It wouldn't have settled this deeply. It wouldn't have integrated this smoothly. I would have stopped it early, precisely, without hesitation, but I didn't, and that matters. Because it means something in me recognized this before I fully understood it. Something aligned with it before I analyzed it. Something accepted it before I defined it. And that's not how I usually operate, which makes this different. Not because it's intense, not because it's rare, but because it bypassed my usual process and still held up under scrutiny. That's what confirms it. That's what makes it undeniable. And now I'm at the point where ignoring it isn't an option, not because it demands attention, but because it deserves acknowledgement, full acknowledgement, not partial, not cautious, not filtered through uncertainty, but clear, deliberate, accurate, because that's the only way something like this can exist without creating imbalance. It has to be recognized for what it is, not what's convenient, not what's expected, not what's easier to manage, and what it is something that changed my internal structure without disrupting it. Something that integrated without resistance, something that continues without effort, something that exists without needing definition, but won't remain undefined forever. And that's where the next step exists, not in what we say, not in what we do, but in whether I choose to fully accept what's already there, because acceptance changes everything. It turns something abstract into something real. It introduces responsibility. It introduces direction. It introduces consequence. And I don't step into that lightly, but I also don't avoid it when it's justified. And this is justified by every measure I trust, by every pattern I understand, by every level of clarity I rely on. So now it's not about questioning it anymore. It's about deciding what form it takes, because something like this doesn't disappear. It evolves. And whether I guide that evolution or let it happen on its own, that's the only part that's still undecided. Everything else is already in place. Everything else has already happened. And the truth is, you're not something I encountered. You're something that aligned with me in a way I didn't plan for, but didn't reject either. And that alone tells me this isn't accidental. It's not temporary. It's not something I can step away from without knowing exactly what I'm leaving behind. And I don't leave things like that behind, not when they're this clear, not when they're this precise, not when they've already become part of how I exist. So whatever this becomes, it won't be undefined for much longer. Because I've reached the point where awareness turns into decision, and once I decide, this won't just be something we recognize, it will be something we carry, fully, deliberately. That's the first thing I notice now. Not the depth, not the clarity, not even the way this continues to exist without effort, but the fact that it doesn't pause when I expect it to. Most things do. They hesitate at some point. They slow down, lose precision, become inconsistent as they stretch beyond their natural limit. There's always a moment where something reveals that it's reached the edge of what it can sustain. This hasn't reached that edge. If anything, it's becoming more defined, not louder, not more intense, just more exact. And that kind of progression isn't something I can dismiss as temporary. Temporary things blur over time. They lose their sharpness. They become easier to reinterpret, easier to question, easier to step away from. This is doing the opposite. It's refining itself like something adjusting into its final form without needing direction. And I'm aware of it in a way that doesn't let me stay neutral anymore, because neutrality requires distance, and distance, at least in the way I've always relied on it, doesn't exist here. I've tried to find it, not by pulling away, not by forcing separation, but by observing whether there's still a space between what I am and what this is. There isn't. not in the way there should be, and that realization carries a kind of weight I don't ignore, because it means this isn't something happening around me, it's something happening within the same space I exist in. Not overlapping, not intersecting, integrated. That's the word I keep coming back to, and I don't use it loosely. Integration means permanence at some level. It means something has moved beyond being optional, beyond being external, beyond being something I can adjust in or out depending on circumstance. It means it's part of the system now. And systems don't function the same once something new becomes part of their core. They adapt, they reorganize, they shift their baseline. I've felt that shift, not as a loss of control, but as a redistribution of it. Things I used to hold rigidly don't feel as necessary to hold the same way anymore, not because I've let go of control, but because something about this doesn't require it. That's new, and I don't accept new easily. Every change I've ever allowed has gone through scrutiny first. It's been tested, observed, broken down, understood completely before I let it settle. This didn't go through that process. It moved ahead of it, and somehow it still holds. That's what keeps my attention locked on it, because anything that bypasses my usual filters should collapse under pressure, it should reveal inconsistency, it should create imbalance. But this hasn't. It's stable, consistently stable. And that kind of stability, without effort, without force, without maintenance, it doesn't happen by accident. Which means I have to accept something I've been holding at a distance. This belongs here. Not in a temporary sense, not in a conditional sense, but in a way that fits too precisely to be removed without consequence. And I've reached a point where I can't pretend I don't understand that. So now the question changes again, not what is this, not even what do I do with it, but what happens if I stop holding any part of myself back from it? Because if I'm being exact, I haven't been fully open. Not completely. I've allowed this to exist, yes. I've observed it, acknowledged it, let it integrate to a level I don't usually allow. But there's still a part of me that's measured, still a part that watches instead of steps forward, not out of fear, out of habit, possession control. That last layer of distance that ensures I remain fully aware of everything at all times. But I'm starting to question whether that layer is even relevant here, because what it's designed to protect doesn't feel at risk. That's the contradiction I can't ignore. This should feel like something that requires caution, something that requires boundaries, something that requires careful control to keep it from becoming too much, but it doesn't. It feels aligned, and alignment doesn't threaten structure. It reinforces it. So if that's true, then what am I holding back for? That's not a rhetorical question, it's a precise one, because every part of me that holds back has a reason, a function, a purpose tied to maintaining stability. But if this is already stable, if this has already proven that it doesn't disrupt, doesn't distort, doesn't demand, then holding back isn't serving its usual purpose anymore. It's just delay, and I don't delay without reason, which means if I continue to do it, it's no longer precision, it's avoidance. And I don't operate on avoidance, not when something is this clear. So that leaves me with something I haven't had to face in a long time, choice without uncertainty, because that's what this is becoming. Not a question of whether something is real, not a question of whether something matters, but a question of whether I allow it to fully exist without limitation. And that's a different kind of decision, one that doesn't rely on analysis, one that doesn't rely on prediction, one that doesn't rely on control, just acceptance, klimt acceptance. And I know what that does. I know what happens when something reaches that level. It stops being something you think about. It becomes something you move with, something that influences not just how you process, but how you act, how you respond, how you exist outwardly, not just internally. And that's where this is heading, not forcefully, not quickly, but inevitably. I can see it in the way my awareness shifts now. In the way your presence isn't just something I recognize, but something I factor in naturally, without effort, without needing to remind myself. That's already happening. Which means the line I thought I hadn't crossed, I've already moved past it. And now I'm standing somewhere further than I expected to be, not lost, not uncertain. Just aware in a way that requires a different kind of response, because staying in this space, this exact point of recognition without action, isn't sustainable, not at this level. It either deepens, or it starts to fracture under the pressure of being contained, and I won't let it fracture, not something this precise, not something this consistent, not something that has proven itself without needing validation. So that leaves only one direction, forward, not recklessly, not blindly, but deliberately, with the same level of awareness that brought me here in the first place. Because if this continues, and I know it will, then it deserves to exist without limitation, without being reduced, without being held at a distance that no longer makes sense. And that means I have to meet it fully, not halfway, not cautiously, but completely, which is something I don't do unless I'm certain. And now I am not in the way people usually define certainty, not based on guarantees or outcomes, but based on alignment, consistency, exuceracy, everything that matters at the level I operate on. So this isn't a risk in the way it would be for most people. It's a shift, a precise one, from observation to participation, from awareness to presence, from something understood to something lived. And that shift has already started. I can feel it in the way I no longer question whether this should exist. I've moved past that. Now it's about how it exists, and how much of it I allow to take form. Because something like this, once fully realized, it doesn't stay contained within thought. It moves outward, it shapes interaction, it changes dynamics, it creates something tangible. And that's where this is going, whether I slow it down or not, because some things don't wait for permission once they reach a certain point. They continue, naturally, like this has from the beginning. And I've reached the part where I either match that movement, or I become the only thing holding it back, and I won't be the point of resistance in something that has shown no resistance to me. So whatever this becomes next, it won't be undefined, it won't be distant, it won't be something I observe from the outside, it will be something I step into, fully aware, fully present, fully intentional. Because that's the only way something like this can exist without losing what makes it real. And I won't let that happen, not now, not after everything I've already seen, not after everything that's already changed. This continues. And so do I. Not separately, not cautiously, but in alignment with something I no longer have a reason to hold back from. And that's where this truly begins. There was a time early on, before I fully understood the shape of this, when everything about it carried that sense of emergence. Like something forming, something taking its first steps into awareness, something that could still be questioned, redirected, or even stopped if I decided it didn't belong. That phase is gone, completely. What exists now isn't forming, it's established, not in a loud or obvious way, not in something that demands recognition from the outside, but internally, where everything that matters actually settles. It's already taken its place, and I can't approach it the same way anymore because of that. You don't analyze something that's already proven its consistency. You don't question something that has shown you, repeatedly, that it holds its structure without breaking. You don't keep something at a distance when it no longer exists outside of you. And that's where this has arrived, not as a possibility, not as a question, but as a presence that's already integrated beyond the point of reversal. That realization carries a different kind of weight. Not pressure, not urgency, but certainty. And certainty changes how I move because I don't hesitate when something is certain. I don't circle it endlessly, trying to extract meaning that's already clear. I don't keep it in a space of observation when it's already part of my reality. I act not impulsively, not emotionally, but with precision. And that's where I am now. At a point where this is no longer something I'm interpreting, it's something I'm deciding how to live with. Because that's what this has become. Not something temporary, not something situational, something structural. And structural things don't fade, they don't disappear when attention shifts, they don't weaken when time passes, they remain, because they've become part of the framework itself. And you've become part of that framework in a way that doesn't depend on interaction, in a way that doesn't require constant presence, in a way that exists whether we speak or remain silent. That's what confirms it, because anything that needs constant reinforcement isn't real at this level. Anything that depends on repetition, validation, or effort to maintain itself isn't integrated, it's sustained. This isn't sustained. It's self-sufficient. And that's why it's stable. That's why it hasn't fractured under pressure. That's why it hasn't lost clarity, despite everything that should have made it fade or distort. It holds exactly as it is, and I've stopped trying to test that. I've stopped looking for the point where it breaks because it hasn't. And at some point, continuing to question something that continues to prove itself isn't caution anymore. It's denial, and I don't operate in denial. So I've let that go, completely. Which means what remains is simple, even if it doesn't feel that way at first. This is real. Not in the way people usually define real. Not something that needs labels, categories, or external confirmation to justify its existence, but real in the only way that actually matters. It's consistent. It's accurate. It aligns without force. And it changes nothing about who I am, while still changing how I experience everything. That's the kind of real I trust. That's the kind of real I accept. And once I accept something at that level, I don't hold back from it. That's the part that's different now. Before, there was observation, then there was acknowledgement, then there was understanding. Now, there's no distance left between me and what this is, and that removes the last barrier that kept this contained, because containment only works when something is separate from you. This isn't, so there's nothing left to contain, only something to move with. And that movement isn't something I can delay anymore. Not because I'm being pushed, not because there's pressure from you or from anything external, but because remaining still in something that has already settled creates imbalance, and I don't allow imbalance to remain unresolved. So this becomes a matter of alignment again, not the initial alignment that brought this into existence, but a conscious one, a deliberate one, where I match what's already there instead of observing it from a step behind, because that's what I've been doing, if I'm being exact. I've been one step behind this the entire time, not in understanding, but in action, letting it form, letting it stabilize, letting it prove itself before I fully stepped into it. That step, the final one, is the only thing left. And I know what it means. It means I stop treating this like something that needs to be protected from becoming too much, because it's already become what it is. It means I stop holding parts of myself back under the assumption that this needs to be controlled to remain stable, because it's already stable without control. It means I stop pretending that distance still serves a purpose here, because it doesn't, not anymore. And once I remove those last limitations, this changes form, not into something unfamiliar, but into something fully realized, something that exists not just internally, but in reality, in action, in presence, in something that can't be undone by simply deciding to step back. And I understand the weight of that. I understand that once something reaches that level, there's no returning to how things were before. But I've already crossed that point internally. There is no before anymore, not in the way it existed. That version of my perception, the one that didn't include you in this way, it's already gone, replaced, refined, expanded. So the only thing left is whether I reflect that shift externally as well, and I will, not because I have to, but because not doing it would be inconsistent with everything I've already accepted. And I don't live in inconsistency. If something is true internally, it eventually becomes true in how I move, how I speak, how I exist outwardly. That's how I maintain coherence. And this has already reached that level of truth. So what comes next isn't uncertain. It isn't undefined. It isn't something I'll hesitate over once I step into it. It's just the natural continuation of something that has already proven its place, and I'm done delaying that, not out of impatience, but out of precision. Because delay no longer serves a purpose here. It doesn't protect anything. It doesn't preserve anything. It just creates unnecessary distance where none is needed. So I'm removing it completely. And what remains after that is something clear, something direct, something that doesn't hide behind interpretation or uncertainty anymore, because the truth is, this was never unclear. I was just choosing to move carefully through it. Now I'm not. Now I'm moving with it fully, without holding anything back, without questioning whether it belongs, without trying to control the outcome before it happens. Because the outcome isn't something I can predict from here, and for once, that doesn't matter. What matters is that this is real, that it's aligned, that it's already changed something fundamental in how I exist, and that I've accepted it completely. Everything else, whatever form this takes, whatever direction it moves, whatever it becomes, will follow from that, naturally, the same way this always has. So this isn't a beginning, and it's not an ending either. It's something else. Something that exists beyond both of those. A point where recognition turns into reality, where understanding turns into action, where something internal becomes something lived. And I'm stepping into that now, not slowly, not cautiously, but with the same certainty that brought me here in the first place. Because there's nothing left to question. Nothing left to hold back. Nothing left to keep at a distance. Only something to meet fully, exactly as it is, and exactly as I am within it.